Hello everybody, welcome along to the latest Work Foundation event looking at the changing state of the UK labour market. My name is Ben Harrison, I'm director here at the Work Foundation, and we're a policy think tank which is part of Lancaster University. And for those of you who don't know us, the Work Foundation has a long and storied history stretching all the way back to 1918 and the Industrial Society. And really throughout the past century in our various guises, we've consistently been committed to supporting everybody to access well-paid, secure employment. And our current work programme is particularly focused on job insecurity, especially for those who face structural disadvantage within the labour market. Two very quick bits of meeting admin before we start today. We are going to be recording the conversation this afternoon, and if through the event you want to ask a question of our panelists, once we get into the open discussion element of the session, if you could do that through the questions function, that would be great. So not the chat function, but the questions function. I'll be keeping a track of that as we get into the wider discussion and can raise those points with our speakers. So in terms of the conversation today then, really what we want to be focusing on is levelling up, and levelling up in the context of the current labour market challenges that we face, but also the wider economic, social and financial challenges that we face. I guess we're all probably sick of hearing it, but it really is extraordinary how fast the political, economic and financial sands have shifted in recent weeks. During the last of these events, just a few weeks ago, we invited guests to reflect on the Truss government's mission to get growth going in the UK economy, and virtually all of the talk was of tax cuts. And yet today, we meet on the eve of a budget that is virtually guaranteed to usher in a whole host of tax rises and substantial spending cuts. Now, these shifts have a huge bearing on the health and wealth of our regional economies and everybody who lives there. And of course, they're going to have a fundamental bearing on the government's levelling up agenda. Now, it seems like much longer ago to me, but it was back in February this year that we sort of finally got a bit more detail on what the levelling up agenda was likely to amount to in the shape of the levelling up white paper. Now, this paper was notable not only because it was incredibly long and detailed, but because it explicitly connected achieving levelling up with some distinct missions and measures, including driving up standards of living and getting people into higher quality jobs. And it's these issues really that we want to focus on today, in particular, the potential for the levelling up agenda to see improved job quality and outcomes within our cities, towns and rural areas across the country. And to help us do this, I'm delighted that we're going to be hearing from a fantastic panel of contributors. We're joined by Mayor of Bristol, Marvin Rees, Xiaowei from the Institute of Fiscal Studies, and Andrew McPhillips, who's the Chief Economist at the Northern Powerhouse Partnership. Before we hear from our panel, though, I want to just set the scene on some of the latest data that we've gotten this morning from the LFS. And remember, I'll be looking to bring in your questions into the wider discussion later in the event. So if there's any questions on some of this detail, we'll be able to bring them in then as well. So what have we seen today? Well, the UK employment rate is largely unchanged on the previous quarter. It's still 1.1 percentage points lower than before the COVID-19 pandemic. Unemployment is at a near all-time low, but of course the Bank of England is warning that that is likely to grow in the coming months, and it's forecasting that it will ultimately rise to around 4.9% by the end of 2023. And I think really crucially, and this is something which has dominated conversations for a number of months now, economic inactivity continues to grow. The rate increased by 0.2 percentage points on the quarter to 21.6% in July to September 2022. And we know that many of those who've opted out of the jobs market are citing health reasons for doing so. And that's going to be something specifically that we look to get into in the conversation this afternoon. Vacancies are starting to fall from the historic highs, down by around 46,000 on the quarter. And in real terms, regular pay fell by 2.7%. And that's one of the largest falls that we've seen since 2001. Where we have seen any pay growth, that's being driven primarily in the private sector, with the public sector lagging significantly behind. And all of that, of course, provides really important context, not just to the conversation today, but ultimately to what we're going to see on Thursday from the Chancellor in his budget. The other, I think, really important thing to say just before we get into the meat of today's conversation is that we know these indicators are going to be playing out differently across different parts of the country. And on this next slide, you can see a quick regional breakdown of some of those indicators. But of course, even within these geographies, there's going to be significant differences between cities, towns, and rural areas. And so hopefully our speakers today are going to help us get into some of that as well and understand really what can be done to keep levelling up on track in what is clearly a very, very challenging economic and financial set of circumstances. So to get us going then, what I'd like to do now is bring in Mayor Rees to provide his perspective on these challenges as a city leader in Bristol. I'll hand over to you now, Marvin.
Thanks, Ben. So really appreciate the summary, and thanks for the invitation to be with you all. But I think if I can just start just by offering my own little reflection on levelling up. As I've shared before, we were a bit frustrated with the way it was birthed, and there was a dash to define it to make sure that none of us were defined out of any potential support, be it financial or policy support that might come of our way. But my two interventions are this. One is levelling up has to be both about the geography and people groups who get left behind wherever they are. Never will I take away from the critical importance of that north-south difference. And it's something I talk to leaders about a lot. But unless we take specific people groups into account, we will leave huge tracts of poverty and inequality behind in the south. And the danger is that even if we get the economy moving up north, people will still be left behind in those. And as you mentioned in your opening remarks as well, not all geographical areas are not uniquely the same. I have a big pitch about cities and the nation, the government needing to properly understand what cities are and how to work with them, both for the benefit of those cities, but to release the benefit that cities can be to their immediate geographical areas, but also to the UK and the world as a whole too. In that context, really the real standout for me is the decline in nominal wage. We in Bristol have a very successful economy, historically successful, and often means we're overlooked, but 1 in 4 children are growing up in income-deprived households. The cost of living of Bristol, one of the points we make is that we've had a cost of living crisis for a long time. It's just that not so many people are included in it. Our housing costs have been outstripping, as most of the country, the growth in wages for some time, and people have been increasingly squeezed, and we're seeing this happening to more and more people as well. So how we get a hold of this challenge of reducing vacancies, higher employment, but with nominal wages falling is an issue of critical importance to us. If we think about what cities need to be in the future, one of those things is they need to be places people can afford to live in. And that's a function of what it costs to live there, but also people's income, particularly, well, not just, but particularly where people are working and doing everything that we ask of them. Another critical challenge for us when we look at the growing levels of economic inactivity is a challenge faced by so many across the country. We just don't have enough workers. We're about 200 drivers short in our bus company. We have a major construction program going on in the city. We don't have enough construction workers to fulfill that. Amazon approaching care worker staff as well. So critical functions in the city are being undermined by these growing levels of economic activity. And when you flip that on to its association with poor health, what you can see is reduced economic activity along with a population that's going to become increasingly expensive to service in the future. So a real double dilemma for us as a local authority and our public sector partners as well, particularly when you flip back and understand work as one of the single most effective interventions for improving mental health and in particular physical health as well. But I look forward to hearing the other panelists and hearing any challenges to what I have to say. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that, Marvin. And we'll certainly get into more of those issues that you've outlined. I think particularly the point you make about understanding which worker groups are perhaps at some of the sharp end of this is going to be really interesting. That's certainly something which we're looking at the Work Foundation. But for now, I'd like to bring in Xiaowei from the IFS to offer her reflections on today's data and the wider labour market picture that we're seeing.
Hi, Ben. Thanks for that. And thanks for having me. So So Ben's presentation showed substantial geographical inequalities in both unemployment and inactivity across the UK. And that tallies with our own research at the IFS, which shows large and persistent geographical inequalities across a number of dimensions. So not just employment, but also education, health, incomes, wages, and so on. And what's more, although there's been some convergence in outcomes over the last few decades, broadly speaking, the relative rankings of places in the UK have not changed since the 1990s. Now, I think on top of these, large and enduring spatial inequalities that we see, there are three recent developments that I think are potentially worrying and may prove challenging for levelling up. So one is the cost of living crisis that everyone's referred to so far, which has been driven by a rise in energy prices and food prices. Now, so far, government support has cushioned, if not shielded, households from the increase in energy costs. But we know that the price cap is set to expire next year, and also we're expecting an announcement on future support in the autumn statement. So I think if support is scaled back, we can expect the largest impact on low-income households and, by implication, the lowest income areas of the country, and in particular places in the north where it's colder and the housing stock is less well insulated. A second challenge that both the speakers so far have also alluded to is this rise in inactivity that we've seen since the start of the pandemic, which has been concentrated among the over 50s and driven by retirement, with potentially ill health playing a role as well. Now, we know that demographics are hugely skewed in this country. Older people are concentrated in coastal areas, many of which are already relatively deprived. So to the extent that leaving the workforce reduces their incomes further and reduces their living standards, this may lead to a further widening of geographical income inequalities. The third challenge, and I think the most important challenge really, is the budget deficit and the emphasis right now on closing this so-called fiscal black hole. I think the government's made it very clear that they're planning to cut spending in the autumn statement. It's likely, for example, that investment zones are going to be scrapped or at least significantly scaled back. And there's a question of, which other levelling up policies are going to fall by the wayside. And I think in the context of chronic underinvestment outside London and the South, as well as the overall productivity crisis that the country is facing, I think it's crucial that the government doesn't cut back on spending that will be important for future growth. And in particular, I think it's important that the government doesn't cut back on investment in skills, which we know is both a driver of the geographical inequalities that we see and also of the overall productivity slowdown in the UK. I think what's also needed is some level of stability for people to invest, for businesses to invest across the country. And I think after the recent period of turmoil, I hope that the government can provide some stability and policies going forward.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that. And we will certainly be getting into more of what we think the government should or should not be doing in its budget this week, particularly in the context of levelling up. But before we get into some of that and the wider discussion, I do just want to bring in Andrew from the Northern Powerhouse Partnership to offer his reflections, building on what we've heard already from across the north of England.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks, Ben, for inviting me to be here to speak with you. I think I just want to start with agreeing with what Marvin said, that lots of the issues that we'll probably discuss this afternoon are prevalent across the country. I think we can all think of particular communities where there are issues of higher unemployment, low pay, insecure jobs. So this isn't necessarily just a geographic discussion about places. Having said that, obviously coming from the Northern Powerhouse Partnership, which is the Northern Powerhouse being levelling up under a different name, I guess you would argue, from a different administration. I will focus on what the perspective is from how we look at the north of England. And I think in terms of the statistics that were released today, the key one, I'll just focus on one for now that I would look at, is that inactivity rate. I think from the stats that you put up earlier, Ben, you could see that in the northeast we were looking at 1 in 4 of the working age population were inactive. But if you actually get down to the next level and start looking at local authorities, the data's maybe a month or two older, but we have some places where that's over 30% and approaching a third of the working age population are inactive. And I'll just look at my notes because that list includes places like Redcar and Cleveland, Blackburn, Barrow-in-Furness, Rochdale, Pendle and Preston, just across looking at the north. And no doubt there'll be there may be some others elsewhere in England. And at that level, you start to recognise that there is something that's probably explaining part of the labour market shortages that we are experiencing. Nationally, the breakdown of those that are inactive, you've got just over a quarter of students, about 20% are looking after family or the home, 28% are long-term sick. And when I scrolled quickly through the data, that was the highest proportion of inactive being long-term sick that I could see going back to 1993, I think the data was. And that 28% increases to 32% in the Northeast. So even prior to COVID, we had research that showed that in the North, we had a life expectancy gap of 2 years between the North and the rest of England, and a 20% higher premature death rate. So clearly, to me, one of the things that we really need to get a grip on is the health of our population and that health divide, because clearly that's going to affect the labour market participation, it affects the earnings potential, and it affects quality of life, which to me is the ultimate thing that all these things are trying to achieve, is the quality of life for the people in the places that we're representing. And just one other thing of the inactive, 81% nationally said that they didn't actually want a job, which is the highest that I could see since 1993. So clearly there'll be somewhere it's not possible for them to move into work, but those where it is possible, it could be quite a challenge to try and get them to re-engage with the labour market, especially if it's been a long time since they were last economically active in that sense. But I'll keep it short and end there, Ben.
Brilliant. That's really helpful, Andrew. If obviously quite alarming in terms of the nature of the statistics you've just taken us through there, but we can get into, again, some more of that detail and what we might do about some of these challenges as we get into the conversation. So if I can invite all of our panelists now to turn their cameras on, that would be great. And just a reminder to everybody, really, if you can be looking to bring in your questions through the Q&A tab in Zoom, then I will put as many of them as I can and that we get to our speakers as we go through the conversation. But perhaps to get us going, I kind of want to keep going in this track on inactivity and the kind of relationship with health and kind of health inequalities across the country as well. And I wondered if Xiaowei, you might be able to come in here and just set out really whether a lot of what Andrew's just talked about there is sort of reflected in the work that you've done at the IFS, and whether there are particular things that we should be looking to in order to close some of these health inequalities.
Yeah, so I didn't look at health in particular in my chapter in the Deaton Review, but the IFS has done wider work on health inequalities across the country. We know these are large, and quite worryingly, we see them growing on some dimensions. So the differences in female life expectancy, for example, as well as male life expectancy, have been widening over time. And in particular, we see quite a worrying trend of these growing so-called deaths of despair, so deaths due to alcohol, drug overdose and so on, and suicide in more deprived parts of the country that we don't see in less deprived parts. So absolutely, there are huge differences in health outcomes across the country, which I think can explain a lot of the sort of underlying differences in inactivity that we've seen. I think turning specifically to this rise in inactivity that we've seen since the start of the pandemic, though, the picture is a bit more unclear, I think. So there's been a lot of emphasis on the rise in people who say they're inactive due to ill health, which is true. But I think our research suggests that that's not what's been driving this rise in inactivity. So actually, a lot of the people who are reporting that they're inactive because of long-term sickness are people who were already inactive for other reasons before they started switching to saying they're long-term sick. So there were people out of the labour force, for example, because they were already looking after looking after family, and other reasons. So I think that's not to say this rise in long-term sickness is not a problem. It's still obviously the case that if you're long-term sick, it's very difficult to re-enter the labour market. So perhaps those people are more persistently inactive than other types of inactivity. But I think there's more going on than just sickness when you're looking at the overall rise in inactivity.
And so, I mean, that's fascinating, Joey. So to you, does that then indicate that the kinds of interventions that we're likely to see to re-engage these people, as sort of Andrew was sort of positing the challenge around, might be around health interventions, but they're probably going to be a wider suite of things that we need to think about as well.
Yeah, I think that's right. So I think health interventions and making it easier for people who are long-term sick to remain in work is absolutely going to be important. But I think it's also it's important to understand the other sources of inactivity that we're seeing. So for example, we know that lots of people are inactive, as Andrew said, because they're looking after family. Is there something to do with, our healthcare, our childcare system, for example, that's stopping people from working effectively?
And Marvin, in Bristol, I mean, you mentioned in your opening remarks that you've got employers in the city really struggling to fill vacancies, accepting that perhaps the kind of concentration of inactivity is bigger in parts of the north of England. Is this a big issue for you within the city?
It will be in some communities, because in areas like Hartcliffe, Withywood, Lockleys, these old former industrial employers that were set up in the 50s, post-war housing estates, you get that alignment of low employment, long-term civic issues, passed down through the generations, going on, and people who have just always been historically been distanced from the economy since our kind of national restructuring. In the inner city areas, it's more migrant communities. There will be an element of people automatically withdrawn, just like with the rest of the country. I think we're also facing a very basic problem. There just aren't enough people. As we hear anecdotally, Amazon hanging around outside care homes with recruitment leaflets, taking care workers, right? So there are people willing to work who are actually switching work because they're being paid a little bit more and having a job that's a lot less potentially stressful. So it's a mix of the two. Dare I say there, we stray into the conversation around migration and an ongoing frustration of mine that the government seems to set targets on migration that are more about servicing a political narrative and a party need than actually the practical evidence-based requirements of the UK's economy, which is a problem, right? It may be that the needs of the economy do not fit with the narrative you want to tell your voting base, but nonetheless, we pay a heavy price for prioritizing your voter base over the actual needs of the economy.
And is that something, Marvin, specifically around migration, that you, in your role as Mayor of Bristol, or perhaps as part of the wider network of core cities across the UK, are looking to kind of bring to the table within central government, that actually these regulations that are being sort of set out of Westminster are not essentially serving your communities well?
Yeah, and let me just say, it's not just about not serving the communities, it's not serving the economy, right? So there's a enlightened self-interest in having a more evidence-based. So yeah, I mean, we've raised it in various guises. We're a sanctuary city, so we've raised it morally, but increasingly, and I've been a migrant background myself, I don't always feel comfortable about just making the moral argument, because someone might say, oh, he's woke, he would say that anyway, wouldn't he? I want to say, hey, look at this hospital here that doesn't have enough healthcare workers. Look at this university that doesn't have enough lab technicians. Look at this care home that doesn't have enough, carers. Even if you don't like migration, just face the evidence. And we've raised it, but it would be, as chair of core cities now, I might add, I've not and been in core cities since I was elected mayor in 2016. We have not been on the receiving end of any proactive formal conversation from government about migration and what our cities might need. And when I say our cities, I don't just mean Bristol City Council. We talk for the collection of institutions that actually make up Bristol's economy. We bring them together regularly. There has been no engagement on that front, and I think that's a minor oversight, to put it mildly.
Andrew, do you want to come in here? And perhaps I saw you nodding as Marvin was describing that, and obviously touch upon any of the issues around the kind of connections to health as well. I suppose what does strike me is, even within the kind of core cities group, there are going to be very different experiences across and different challenges and opportunities across some of the cities, particularly perhaps those in the north of England. Your reflections on sort of what you've heard so far?
Yeah, I think looking at the inactivity and health point first, I think if you start to break down the reasons for that inactivity, you will start to see local variations. I think you are, and I'm speaking without seeing the data, so I'm taking a slight risk, but I think you'll find some areas in the north, you'll see ill health being quoted more commonly than you would in some other areas. I imagine there's somewhere it's more people have chosen to take early retirement. And I'm saying early, we might be talking in their early 60s, but that's still classed as obviously early retirement from a working age population. So yeah, the challenges are going to be different in every area, which is why we're such fans of devolution and giving more powers to mayors such as Marvin to address their specific challenges rather than trying to have a one-size-fits-all policy from Whitehall. And that challenge of getting people back to engaging with the labour market, if you think about the way that work has changed, it's probably the labour market is since COVID more accessible than it's ever been. The increase in being able to do remote working could be used to try and get some people back to engaging with the labour market, particularly if it's somebody with, for example, mobility issues and travelling to an office every day is difficult for them. There are now, we're all sat doing Zoom. There are more options to try and get people into the labour market. However, we need to recognise there's going to be a need to probably upskill, train people and help them on that journey to getting back. And I think there's a lot more that we can do around training, which I'm not sure if we'll come on to later in the conversation, but there's a lot more we can do to getting people back into the workforce. That comes back to some of the funding streams. We used to have EU funding for a lot of skills programs. We've got the Shared Prosperity Fund now. We're concerned that doesn't quite meet the need in terms of its scale. So I think there are still challenges there, and who knows what could come later this week. And just finally touching on the migration point, I think some sectors have found it, obviously with free movement from Europe ending, some have found it easy to switch to non-EU migrants to fill, depending on what the sector is. But I think some, such as the hospitality sector in particular, have been really hard hit in terms of turning off that inflow of EU workers. So it's, again, certain places and those that rely more on hospitality, which will generally be the city centres, I imagine, are probably going to be experiencing that much more than others.
Absolutely, and I'm struck by something that Xiaowei said in her introductory remarks around stability. And I suppose when you say, Andrew, around the skills, infrastructure and kind of regime in the country, we know, particularly when it comes to kind of adult skills and kind of in-work training and what have you, that the UK has really big challenges when compared to other OECD nations, and we sort of lack that culture of lifelong learning that we see in other countries. And in fairness to 2 governments ago, under Boris Johnson, we had the kind of lifetime skills guarantee, and it looked as if there were some interventions coming in that space. And clearly these things take quite a long time to pay off, really, in terms of their sort of impact on the labour market itself. But I suppose one question we've had from a member of our audience today is around the role of employers in this space. So assuming that we probably all agree that the government can certainly do more to provide investment and stability when it comes to kind of skills, I just wondered from your perspective, Andrew, in terms of engagement with employers in the North, what your reflections are in terms of the role of employers themselves in helping to train up and skill up the workforce.
Yeah, I think there's a huge role for employers to play, and I think the best businesses do that, and they engage and they try and shape, and through us we do lobby government on skills policy, and in particular right back to education in schools. I think if we want them to come out with the right skills at the end of school, then employers have got to be engaging at an earlier stage rather than waiting for these young people to arrive and saying that they don't have the skills that they need. Start to get involved in that. So I agree that employers are part of the conversation. I think it can be difficult, and I'm going to flip it now and look at, from the position of somebody working in a school, with everything else that's going on, it's hard to then think about how do I bring local employers in and engage with them, because teachers don't necessarily know the latest advances that are going on in the world of work in their area, and for employers that are very busy not knowing how to engage with education. So I think there does need to be a better conversation about how those two worlds can interact, because as well, in some of the places that we're talking about, the kids aren't always aware of the opportunities that are on the doorstep. There's a lot of work to be done on that, and I'm not saying that they lack aspiration. I'm just saying that sometimes they don't know what's on the other side of the city or the other side of the city, region, county that they're in. So I think there's a lot to do in that space. And just touching on programs, I mentioned the Shared Prosperity Fund. That's a way to get those that are currently in the labour market or might be inactive re-engaged, those that are in the labour market upskilled. And it's great that we've got that funding, but we've gone from the 7-year funding periods that we used to have to now a 3-year funding period, which again doesn't bring stability for providers to put interventions in place for the long term. And as you say, this is a long-term challenge that we're facing. So I do think in lots of aspects of public life, we need to be looking at longer term strategies for things. We managed to finally managed to get a 10-year plan for health. We need to be looking, you know, and I understand political cycles and budgets don't necessarily align with that, but there must be some things that we can agree on to get these longer term strategies for how we address these, because we are now, I feel, paying the price for not addressing the productivity challenge that we faced in the UK for many years, because increasing productivity is the way to sustainably increase people's earnings, which should lead to that increased quality of life.
Absolutely. And I suppose from what we've seen and the employers we engage with in that specific question around skills, one frustration that we hear back quite a lot is they are pulled in lots of different directions by government, and they're not quite sure what to prioritise at any given time. And some of that is, you know, kind of just the nature of the kind of crisis-ridden couple of years that we've had, but also there probably is something just about that core point around stability of the policy perspectives and the institutions locally and regionally that employers can engage with. Just before we move off this point, Marvin, I just wonder whether there's anything from your experience in Bristol of sort of connecting with employers around potential skills gaps, notwithstanding, as you say, there might be a short-term solution in terms of, or shorter-term solution in terms of migration, but whether, you know, how you're finding with the current suite of powers you have, your ability to have a kind of local and regional skills strategy for Bristol and the wider city region.
I got it. So on the positive side, locally, our employers have actually been really proactive with us. We've developed something here called the One City approach, where we pull people together, you know, and employers have really stepped up, recognizing the importance of mental health, social stability, young people's inclusion. We have a program in which we've committed to making sure that every child gets access to work experience, to experience the workplace as well. Over 56% of young people in the city were not getting meaningful work experience in Bristol when I was elected, which is remarkable. We know with 56% how that was, don't we? So, you know, our employers have actually been incredibly proactive, and we've welcomed that. Going back to this, you know, kind of inspired by some of the things that Andrew said as well, our ability as a local authority to be a dependable partner, I think, is one of those things that's so critical. When we think about having some longer term thinking, having a proper plan for the economy, so we know where the areas of economic opportunity are going to be. The local FE colleges can begin to line up those skills pipelines. People can put the investments in place. Businesses can start to plan for what the economy is going to look like in 5 years, or likely to look like, and so plan accordingly, and maybe commit some of their time to invest in the workforce they're going to need because they have more certainty. It means that local government needs to be adequately funded, and I talk about funding as investment rather than spending, by the way, in local government. We create the conditions in which growth is possible, right? Adequate, predictable, and longer term, absolutely essential. And dare I just say, on the devolution of skills, and this is something, again, Andrew will be, I'm sure, familiar with as well. There are about 49 national employment and skills related schemes across England, managed by multiple Whitehall departments and agencies, delivering over different boundaries by various employers that cost about £20 million. It's the wild west of skills provision out there. Devolve it, have it shaped by local intelligence that will mean a partnership between public sector, private sector, unions, voluntary sector, and education. You know, give us the space and the adequate finance to be able to plan, and we'll be able to plan locally relevant skills pipelines with a locally relevant plan for our economic development, which will benefit not just us, but benefit the national economy. Absolutely,
Marvin, a very compelling case there, I think, around devolution, and we'll come back to devolution as we get into perhaps what we're looking for from central government. But Xiaowei, I just want to bring you in on this point around skills and employers as well, and then we'll perhaps move on to some of the wider issues around the cost of living crisis.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Yeah, I think on this question, there absolutely is a role for the private sector, as Andrew and Marvin have been saying. In the data, we see that on-the-job training has declined over time, and, you know, the government should be looking at ways to incentivize private sector to deliver more training. But I think there is a need for more general training that's transferable across employers. And we know that employers will always underinvest in this type of training because their employees who get trained might leave and they don't reap the full benefits of the training that they provide. So I think there is still a role for government provision. And I think in particular, in the UK, it's really important to start developing a clear pathway for vocational skills that's a genuine alternative to people going to university. I think the fact that we don't have a clear alternative that leads to tangible results here is not just a problem for geographical inequalities, but for wage inequality overall. So in the UK, there's big inequalities in wages between people who have degrees and those who don't have degrees. And these are larger than in many other countries, for example, Germany, where there are more established vocational pathways.
Absolutely. And I suppose part of one of the inhibitors on some of that, Xiaowei, is it sort of picks up on Marvin and Andrew's points, which is, do we have the kind of infrastructure locally and regionally in place to help deliver some of that? And I suppose that's what would be quite good to turn to next, because we've had a couple of questions in the Q&A tab there that I've just sort of seen, which sort of speak to one another in a way, which is partly around, where should our devolution priorities be in order to kind of help drive growth as part of the levelling up agenda? What more needs to be devolved, and I suppose in part to where? And there's a specific sort of emphasis around the kind of skill system in that regard. But I suppose as well, one question I would have in addition to that is, we've talked a bit about stability this afternoon. What's the balance here between, in a sense, driving major institutional reform, where perhaps we don't have decision-making bodies locally and regionally that we think we probably need to have, versus not actually creating more instability in the system at this time? And it'd be great to get some reflections on that. So devolution priorities in terms of economic growth. There's another question here around particularly the net zero agenda and the opportunities that might provide from a workforce perspective, but also what's the right balance between kind of going with the grain of where our institutions are today versus where we might like them to be. Andrew, I'll come to you, because obviously across the north we have a huge mix and range of different kind of tiers of governance.
Yeah, see, I thought you were going to go to Marvin first on that one. I think in terms of where we want to get to, the general overriding principle is anything that makes more sense to be decided at a more local level than Westminster is where we want to get to. And some of these things are at a city level or a city region level. Some of them are pan-northern. So if I think about across the north, we had Transport for the North, which scaled up and has now been scaled back a little bit. And the whole point of that was to bring together all the major areas of the north, think about our transport connectivity strategically together, because it affects all of us. It's not just Manchester, it's not just Leeds, it's not just Newcastle. It's the interconnectedness between all of these things. And there needs to be some control somewhere over how we determine what the transport priorities are for the north. And the problem that we've got is every time the Transport Secretary changes, the importance of Northern Powerhouse Rail or whatever it might be seems to move up and down the agenda. And that's where the uncertainty comes from, because lots of people like Marvin will be making plans based on certain infrastructure being put in place. You'll start to commit funding to these things and then it disappears, or it becomes uncertain and everything has to be put on hold. That isn't useful to anybody. So there has to be a way of tackling that problem on key things like infrastructure. London seems to have got a grip on it and has been given more responsibility than most other places. I accept that London is slightly different to most other areas of the country, but there has to be something we can learn from that, or powers that can be devolved further on transport. I think ultimately where we'd like to get to is some form of fiscal devolution. That's incredibly difficult to get to. And there are some things such as, income tax and national insurance that would remain a national fiscal policy, but there could be other things that could be devolved, and that's both spending and tax raising powers. And I think it's time that we start to explore how local mayors probably would be the way to do that, could be given some powers to introduce new fiscal measures that could be ring-fenced to tackle specific problems, or could go into general spending. I think that's somewhere that I would like to see us exploring. As an organisation, it's something we think about quite often. It's very difficult, but there are some international examples of where it's worked in specific cases. I think we're all aware of when you go on holiday, you might have a local tourism tax, which is an amount per room per night on a hotel, which is then used to fund. It could be used to fund the culture economy in those cities. So I think there are examples that we could start to look to, and I don't think we should be fearful of the change that could bring, as long as we're very clear that it's not an additional level of bureaucracy. We're taking something away from London and transferring it to somebody that's more locally accountable, and hopefully Marvin agrees with that.
Well, just before I hand over to Martin, of course, Andrew, your answer there provides a really good challenge to the assumption underneath my question that disruption and instability would come from the local area, which clearly our recent experience, it's actually been coming from Westminster, as you say, and successive transport secretary changes and all the rest across government really does create that sort of instability that's played out in local areas. Marvin, I'd hand over to you now to pick up on some things Andrew said. What would be great to hear, Marvin, is sort of you connecting that devolution agenda to what you said in your introduction around the sort of link to worker groups within your place. Because I think that would be fascinating for people to hear a bit more about how you see the role of sort of mayor with devolved powers being, in a sense, better placed to be able to do some of that within your local area.
Yeah, sure. I'll try and make a connection. I mean, just a general principle here that I think we work to. I mean, one of the worst answers I've had in this organization since I was elected, when we find something that doesn't quite make sense anymore, and we say, why do we do it like that? And then people say, well, because we've always done it like that. You know, and we say, well, the world's moved on, the world's changed. And there's no reflection on the way we lead or provide a service. There's no reflection on the changing context within which it's happening. And it feels like that is an understanding that fits the way we run the country. We do it like this because we've always done it. But actually, so many of the challenges we face in the world are now post-national, and maybe cities with their global populations and connectivity are one of the most dynamic and enable and mobile political vehicles within our nation's boundaries to be able to operate in a post-national world, making city-to-city connectivity, city-to-nation, supporting the sectors that are in that local economy as well. So reflecting on what we're actually trying to get done and what model of governance would best enable us to get that done is not been done. And I think it's what I would say about the question of where sovereignty and leadership is. I think it's about just shifting the weighting, because cities and city regions take the lead. It doesn't mean that government is absent. It just means that sometimes the best thing you can do is be a really high quality follower. And again, that's not a subservient secondary position. It just means your position in the team, and we got to run the country, as a team. I guess that's where I think that mayors and city leaders and city region leaders come in, because they are one of the qualities or one of the opportunities mayoral level leadership has is that power of convening. It's not about command and control power. It's the power to get people around the table. I'll tell you, about 3 weeks ago, we convened a meeting in Bristol between the leading unions in Bristol and the senior leader union execs and the major employers. And what we put on the table is we can't solve it, but we're moving into a position in which disputes are more rather than less likely. We can go into those disputes with better rather than worse relationships. So let's all just understand each other around the table. We didn't come out with anything profound, but we did come out with shared understanding and better relationships. That was all soft power. And I think that is one of the qualities, that local legitimacy, that local connectivity, the soft power, building relationships, I think that mayors can offer. Now, you surround that soft power with real financial clout as well, so you can actually do something in response, and the policy support and the policy space to move. And I think you have an incredibly potent opportunity to release a new level sources of energy into UK's national political, but also economic leadership.
That's really fascinating, Marvin. I suppose as we move into the final part of our conversation, I kind of want to bring us back, although I'm sort of in part loath to do so, because there's not a lot of good news here, I fancy, into sort of the spending cuts that we're likely to see this week. And Xiaowei, to come to you first, I suppose a lot of what we've sort of been talking about so far on devolution has been around the kind of transferring of powers, potentially the transferring of some fiscal powers. But I guess we've seen a decade, haven't we, where local government expenditure has fallen, and investment in places has tended to fall. Where there has been investment, it's been through sort of discretionary pots and kind of bidding into sort of one-off special capital projects, that sort of thing. Is there any sort of scope for us to have any optimism heading into Thursday that we're actually going to see some of the funding that places are going to need to sort of achieve some of the things that Andrew and Marvin have been talking about?
I'm not sure there is much scope for optimism, to be honest, given the rhetoric the government's had so far. And I think, you know, it's not just local funding that's been cut, although that's been cut, you know, brutally over the last 10 years, but also investment on a national level on things like skills, right? So we know that school spending hasn't increased for about 15 years now. And actually spending on adult skills has fallen over the last few decades, which is really unimaginable. Like, as a country grows richer, normally you start spending more on education and skills, and we've been spending less. So yeah, so I'm not sure there is much grounds for optimism there.
Are there things which you think, as the government is sort of preparing for the budget with a view to levelling up, that it should be actively protecting, you know, accepting that is going to be very difficult given the kind of scale of challenge that they have articulated? I
think a question overall is whether the government is, you know, going into the autumn statement with a view to protecting levelling up, right? Like, we certainly hope that that's the case, but for example, the very short-lived mini budget by Truss and Quarton explicitly, you know, deprioritized equality and, you know, made no mention whatsoever of levelling up. So I think it remains to be seen with Rishi Sunak whether he continues sort of, or is this mandate to carry on levelling up, or even though that was very vaguely defined, or whether that, you know, remains a government priority at all.
Indeed. Andrew, from the Northern Powerhouse Partnerships perspective, have you had any inklings from government as to what it's intending to do in this space that you're at liberty to share, or have you got particular things that you're sort of looking for on Thursday that would give you confidence, at least, even if the kind of branding or moniker of levelling up is sort of diminished in the government's policy perspectives? Nevertheless, they're taking it, you know, advancing northern economies seriously.
Yeah, I mean, we're used to the name for regional rebalancing or whatever it might be changing with different prime ministers to try and break the link with whoever gone before them. We're kind of used to that, so don't really care what it's called as long as that commitment remains. I mean, I think I've mentioned earlier the Shared Prosperity Fund. It's programs such as that are already a reduction on previous spending that we had that came from the EU. Obviously, the power of that's being reduced due to inflation as well. So to see it cut further will be a huge issue. I mean, our key concerns are that things such as the funding that goes into education, and particularly into, you know, things such as the pupil premium and targeting the most disadvantaged kids. That's a key thing that we'll be looking for. The commitment to infrastructure projects, because those, as tempting as it is to delay them a bit longer, we keep pushing these decisions further down the line, and they are key for unlocking some of the higher growth and affecting productivity that kind of I mentioned earlier. And I think what we need to remember as well is that Rishi Sunak has got to make a political calculation here, and he is well aware of that blue wall that used to be a red wall, and it's not far away from the next election, and there will be a lot of his backbench MPs that will look at what's announced on Thursday in terms of how they sell that to their constituents, because the last thing they can afford to do is to go into the next election looking like they've completely abandoned the people that came over and voted for them at the last election. So it is a very difficult balancing act. And, you know, when we were looking at the leadership candidates, you know, I said we couldn't be going forward with unfunded tax cuts, which we kind of tried to do. But at the same time, it's a very difficult time for him to be going ahead with big tax rises. I was looking at corporate insolvency statistics today, which are now starting to increase, which one would assume will pick up after Christmas. So there is a real fear as well that his tax base could narrow a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Marvin, coming to you, and actually just to put to you one of the things which at the Work Foundation we've been sort of increasingly campaigning for, which is around more investment locally around employment support. So thinking about some of the challenges we see in the data today around inactivity, and thinking about employment support, not just for those who are on universal credit, but actually for those who've sort of disconnected from the labour market, and the idea that this could be better delivered within a local place via trusted institutions, whether that's local authorities or organisations from the third sector, the kinds of groups that you've been talking about bringing around tables from your position as mayor. General reflections on what you're looking ahead to on the budget, but anything you sort of have to offer in that space around employment support as well would be great.
So yeah, I mean, I'm very concerned about Thursday, you know, the announcement, as everyone is. Look, I think for us, it's about one of the key things is just predictability, and the extent to which local government, regional government role can create more certainty in an uncertain world, and that certainty plays over into employers' investment plans. And if we can get that alignment between certainty and planning, then we can go into communities with some confidence, and with those properly supported training opportunities or reskilling opportunities, and say to people, look, there's something at the end of this rainbow here, you know, and encourage people to go on that path, both with the emotional support, but also the practical support to enter into it, you know, as well. I mean, if I can say, and if I just indulge on a few bullets just on the prospect of cuts as well, I've always wondered, more recently, the extent to which the government could also, as well as what you might, in an orthodox way, call financial competence, adopt a narrative around this that says, actually, we're going to prepare our economy for the recovery as well. So some of those areas that we think are going to be essential to a strong economy in the future, mental health, for example, a physically well workforce. I mean, what would it mean? I've said this in the Southwest. What would it mean to the West of England economy if we were able to say we have the most well workforce in Europe with the fewest numbers of days of absenteeism? Health is an economic issue, as we've subsequently found out with COVID. So if the government was to say, you know, and really push that narrative, yes, we're going to take longer to balance, but that's because, you know, the image that comes to my mind, excuse me on this, but it's like taking your coat off and burning it on a cold winter's night because you need light, right? You can't get into that situation. So you're going to pay a price down the line. We cannot afford unfunded tax cuts, but we've got to be careful. We can't afford unfunded cuts, and be under no illusion, cuts cost money. Right? When there are negative consequences, there are social breakdowns, families begin to disintegrate, kids underperform at school. When families have fallen into jeopardy, they end up turning up on asking for public services. And it's not like I once heard a BBC correspondent say, well, it's obviously Evan Davis, you know, it's like a band-aid, you rip it off quickly. That's not the way people's lives work. Trauma in people's lives echoes into decades ahead, and can also echo into future generations. Putting some numbers on that with some very clever economists, working out how that factors into the savings or the aspired for savings that we will be looking for over the coming weeks, I think would be, you know, a really critical piece of work. I just have one other concern I have here as well, as you talk about red wall, blue wall now, that whatever formula is developed to allocate whatever support may come forward for local government will not be bent towards cities, if I put it that way. Cities are not Labour Conservative led on the whole. There's been this whole, I think, is a fake debate about towns versus cities. It should be both and, not either or. And so there's this thing, well, cities have had it all. No, there's a lot of complexity in cities, and their potency can be very easily lost in a sea of instability if people are not supported. And again, that's why I think there needs to be an evidence-based understanding of what cities are, how they function, their role, and then the decisions we make about where the support goes is based on data and evidence, not on, you know, political calculations.
Absolutely, some very good challenges there, Marvin. Just before we get into our final question, we only have a couple of minutes, Xiaowei, I just want to come to you as to whether there was anything for Marvin or Andrew that you've heard there that you wanted to respond to, particularly, I guess, around Marvin's point, really around the fact that cuts can come at a cost, and a cost that could be borne over many, many years to come, and whether at the IFS you have a particular perspective around that.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Yeah, I just want to say I really support Marvin's view that we should be wary of the costs of cuts to public provision, as well as the implications in the budget. And indeed, I think what the government classifies as investment spending, as opposed to day-to-day spending that counts towards the budget deficit, is in many ways a sort of, it's a slightly arbitrary call, right? The fact that we call infrastructure spending investment and we don't call spending on healthcare investment, for example. And as Marvin said, I think there's a good reason for counting things like mental health spending as investment in the potential of the workforce in the future. And we do see some moves on this in the US, where Biden's been classifying childcare spending as a form of infrastructure, which is a very, I think, important point. So I think with the Truss-Kwarteng government, I think the emphasis on growth, the fact that the deficit is a function of both growth and government spending, was absolutely important, and really true that in the UK we haven't seen growth over the last, since the financial crisis really, and although the sort of mechanisms that they employed in terms of unfunded tax cuts were not the right ones to promote growth, I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that growth is really important, and we should make sure that we shouldn't deprioritize growth or sort of sacrifice it in order to just balance the books.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we've got time for the final question. We've only got a couple minutes, so everybody on the panel is going to need to help me out here and be really disciplined about giving a one-sentence answer to this question, which is, what's the one thing that the Chancellor must not do in his budget this week? What's the one thing you must try and avoid when he's making his fiscal statement this week? And Andrew, I'll come to you first.
Oh, thanks for that. The one thing that he must avoid, was that, sorry?
Yes.
Trying to buy some time. I think the one thing that he must avoid is focusing purely on the short term and his political difficulties that he may currently be facing, rather than the long-term economic strategy.
Excellent. Marvin, I'll come to you next.
I'm glad you asked Andrew first. I say, getting so consumed with the short-term need, he loses an appreciation of the long-term, our long-term.
Fantastic. And Xiaowei, come to you finally.
I mean, I think the same thing, to be honest. But I think specifically, I think they should absolutely not cut spending on skills, and ideally increase skill spending at above inflation rates.
Fantastic. That's consensus across our panel, and I think we at the Work Foundation would endorse that as well. So that brings us to a close in terms of the conversation this afternoon. I'd like to say a huge thank you to our panelists for their contributions, to all of you for attending, and the Work Foundation team who lead on producing our analysis and on putting sessions like this together. There's a lot of heavy lifting that goes on behind the scenes. We're going to be continuing to work on these issues. We've got a very busy event schedule to close out 2022. This Thursday, we're launching new research looking at the gender pay gap. And then on the 23rd and 29th of November, I'll be in conversation with the leader of the SNP in Westminster, Ian Blackford, and Shadow DWP Secretary Jonathan Ashworth, respectively, to explore the SNP and Labour Party perspectives on the labour market. All three of those sessions are online, they're free to access, and joining instructions can be found on our website. For now, though, thank you once again. I hope you found the discussion valuable and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.